As 300 Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the fate of 52 hostages, the United States and Iran would change forever. Contemporarily in America, the 1980 election was happening. During the Iranian hostage crisis, Jimmy Carter was the president, and he would have to handle the drastic challenge of this large event. The Iranian hostage crisis had an immense effect on not only the 1980 election, but also the overall reputation of Jimmy Carter. The start of the crisis can be traced back to Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini was a political leader in Iran and voiced the people's opinions on such matters as the relationship between Iran and America. Throughout the revolution, the American embassy in Tehran received lots of protests from the Iranian citizens. All of the past conflicts and disagreements between the two countries would eventually lead up to the Iranian hostage crisis. During the 444 days that the hostages were held, the situation varied and adapted. At the beginning, it was just peaceful Iranian students known as the Muslim followers of the Imam's line, carrying cards that say, "Don't be afraid, we just want to sit in." From the 52 people held hostage, only 2 of them are women. The reason for this was throughout the days, multiple people were released. Khomeini stated that they were, quote-unquote, victims of the oppression of American society. All of the hostages were released on January 20th, 1981. The hostage crisis had a large impact on the strength of the White House and the military because of the multiple failed attempts to rescue the hostages. After these disappointments, the Rose Garden strategy was initiated. The strategy allowed the situation to be secluded into the White House. Even though this may not seem like an important adaptation, it showed that the system could be put into dysfunction. The next solution to rescue the hostages was created by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, and Jimmy Carter. It was called Operation Eagle Claw. This operation forced the military to get involved, and in retrospect ended up being a waste of resources and made the hostages no closer to freedom. This failed attempt also had a larger impact on Jimmy Carter because after all these trials he still did not succeed, so he was dubbed weak and inefficient. Jimmy Carter was president for the entirety of the crisis and worked to solve it up until his very last day in office. Not only did the constant media coverage around the hostage put Carter in a bad light for his inability to solve the crisis, but the amount of planning and effort that he put in took away from campaigning for the election. Inversely, Ronald Reagan, Carter's opponent, appealed to voters with better taxes, strong defense, and national pride, something the American public craved in a time of hardship. All of these factors contributed to the result of Reagan winning the election, with the electoral votes being 489 to 49. On January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, and a few hours later, the hostages were released. The crisis can be identified as a major contributor to the outcome of the election and still continued to have an effect for decades later. The relationship between the United States and the Islamic world has continued to degrade over 43 years since the hostage crisis. Eventually, the hostages were released because international countries refused to aid Iran in the Iran-Iraq war unless this long-awaited justification took place. After this happened, there were sparks of patriotism across the U.S. of such greatness that hadn't been seen since the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Awareness in the American public about Iran, the Shah, or terrorism was introduced after the crisis and would forever change the U.S. perspectives. For the hostages, there was some amount of compensation. In 2015, the Congress issued U.S. victims of state-sponsored terrorism funds to assist the hostages and their families. They were each set to receive $10,000 for every day that they were held captive, or a total of $4.44 million. Disappointingly, only a small part of the money has been paid out. The 1980 election, the overall reputation of Jimmy Carter were greatly affected by the Iranian hostage crisis. The presidency of Carter would not only change the fate of the U.S., but also the relationship between the country and Iran, a relationship heavily important to the American public. Preconceived notions about Iranian people and terrorism is currently an issue that faces the U.S., especially with the new movement in Iran about women's rights and freedoms. In the future, there will be more events that stem off this complicated relationship, but the root of the relationship can always be traced back to the Iranian hostage crisis.